So maybe it's just us. I don't know where the Travis Hunter twins are, but
And then Sean?
yeah, Sean has not been around lately. I'm guessing it's just because he's busy. Because he hasn't actually communicated with me, so I don't know. But given that he seemed pretty interested in both books, I'm guessing it just must be because he was busy.
Because he always participated.
Yeah, he always had good things to say. And he only participated in the first few, but Brad was had been a long time participant, active participant when he was an undergraduate at Texas State. But he's the same way. He was in the first couple, but then he just got too busy. So, that's what happens. I mean, this is actually fairly typical that a lot of people show up at the beginning and then life happens and people start dropping out because they're just so busy.
Yeah.
I don't know. Just sort of Ed, do you know whether you're going to be able to participate in either seminar in the fall, or are you going to be too busy, do you think?
I won't be I'm being sadly realistic. I know I won't be able to be involved in both. I'm running for re-election to the city council on top of already being on the city council. And so if I have an opponent, I can't. And then, I mean, this is going to be the strangest election season. What's appropriate, right? Do you knock on a door? Do you not knock on a door? I mean, do you have some kind of event and people just, scream at you? And so everybody's, I feel like I'm a newly blind person. I don't have a point of reference. So could you remind me what the two seminars had you all decided what the two seminars would be?
So the philosophy seminar is going to be on a couple of books by the 19th century German idealist Schelling. And Sean, what are the names of those two books again?
Oh, you mean Chase?
Sorry, Chase.
Yeah. They are, I can't remember. Oh, it's Philosophical Investigations into the Essence of Human Freedom, I believe is the first one.
And then Ages of the World, is that?
Yeah, and then the second one is The Ages of the World, which...
That's gonna, so they're both fairly short. So I'm sorry, I cut you off, Chase. Go ahead.
I was just going to explain that there's multiple versions of The Ages of the World because it's something he never actually finished in total. It was supposed to basically be the history of the universe from its very beginnings to now and then into the future. So it's supposed to be about the past, the present, and the future. He only ever finished the past, and he had something like 7 versions of it. He kept rewriting it because he was trying to explain the genesis of everything, which is kind of hard to do, but
yeah,
should make for an interesting read.
And what's the other one? The other seminar?
Oh, so that's the literature one. So we haven't decided exactly what we want to do for that one yet, but I think it's looking like Kafka is probably the most likely one. The other options are Gravity's Rainbow, Thomas Pynchon, and what was and then House of Leaves, which I don't think that's going to happen because I suggested it, and now I think that one would be too bizarre, basically, even more than Gravity's Rainbow. But I'm thinking it's probably going to be Kafka, which there's a book, The Essential Kafka, that has the trial and the castle and some of his short stories. So I think we would be reading that.
I think given my state of mind right now,
no Kafka.
but no, I just can't handle Kafka. I'm not saying jump in head first to the bizarre novel you didn't mention, but I'm thinking I need Schilling. I think I vote. I'll go to the Schilling philosophy one, and you guys are on your own for literature.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah,
gonna participate in the literature as I can, based on how busy I am. But you've probably picked up Chase and Hunter and Travis and Joey are actually running that one. They're doing all the development on that one.
Yeah, so it's going to be, I think, connected with this Discord server, but we still may have the meetings on Zoom. We haven't really decided anything concrete yet.
Okay.
And probably what I'm going to do is, I'm guessing about a week before classes start, I'm going to send out an invitation email to all philosophy undergrads, philosophy grads, and to everyone who has recently been, expressed interest or participated in a seminar. So Ed, you'll be on that list, and I'll just send out an email announcement and then invite people to kind of, sign up for it. So the reason I'm doing it early then is because and this is what I've done in the past, I would like to have the seminar start the second week of classes, and Craig has agreed to purchase books. So I need to get a list of participants so they can order books. And I'm not sure, in the past he's purchased all the books. I'm not sure if he'll be willing to do that just because concerns and because of the expense of the books, but I'm sure he will at least be willing to defer, to pay for part of the cost of the books anyway. So that's my general plan, is to send out an announcement in a couple of weeks or so. And then I don't know if Chase and the other guys, I'm not sure if they've decided if they're going to, invite like everybody like that, or if they're just going to keep it the core group or what. But that's, like I've said, I've just basically said, I'll participate if I can, and you guys take care of it.
Sure. Well, no, that's fair. You've been doing an awful lot.
Personally, I wouldn't mind inviting the philosophy majors. Maybe, I don't perceive a lot of them sticking with it. How they usually do, they'll show up for like one or two.
Yeah. The typical thing is I get like 12 or 15 people who say yes, and then by the end of the seminar, it's like this. It's like, 3, 4, 5, and there was one where it was just me and Joey at the end. And then I think Chase with the Hesse was me and you and somebody else, seems like.
I was in Hesse.
Oh, that was, you were in Hesse, okay. So.
What was I can't remember his name. What was the other guy that was in, I don't know, I'm blanking on his name, but there's another guy in there.
Oh, Ian.
Yeah, Ian, that's it, yeah.
He was the philosophy superstar. There was a guy who was like, he got the award at graduation for like the most godlike undergraduate.
Ian was the guy in our 19th century class who was like very economically minded. Maybe I don't think he was a philosophy major. He knew a lot about Marx and that kind of stuff, but maybe didn't particularly agree. I know who you're talking about. He graduated like with Brad or something. And yeah, he got all those rewards. He was so busy, and he would always manage to come to the meetings.
Yeah, I had no idea that guy was involved in so much stuff until the president or whoever it was introduced him to the whole graduating group and said, he's done this, he's done this, and he's done this. I'm like, oh my God, I had no idea. But he was a super nice guy and very, very into the seminars. So, well, so enough of all that. we got a bunch of, I can't, how many are there? 5, 4 or 5?
Yeah, 6 maybe.
6?
Yeah. I was thinking for some of these, maybe not even necessarily go in order, maybe see which ones we really want to talk about the most or something like that.
That's
I don't
fine
know.
with
I
me.
liked all of them. They were all interesting to me, but
That's
I
fine.
guess some kind of stand out a little more.
The one I had the most difficulty with was I don't even know how to pronounce his name, but Valerie as symbol, mostly because I don't know anything about him, you know? So that made that one a little more difficult. I know a tiny bit about Whitman, but I don't know anything about that guy. So I think the last paragraph was interesting, and then there was another one where he referred to a lot of people that I didn't know. So maybe it was the one on Kafka, but that one was pretty interesting. So anyway, yeah, I don't know. So do any of you have a one that you've found that you feel like we really ought to talk about?
So I've heard of Paul Valery many times, but I've never read any of his stuff. I think I kind of got generally what he was trying to say, Borges, even without reading Valery, but it's all kind of guesswork, I guess. So some of the stuff in the Avatars of the Tortoise basically like broke my brain trying to understand some of the stuff. Like, you know, the general Zeno's paradox thing is kind of old news at this point, but the way that they kind of, he sort of showed how it extends to all these different things was kind of mind-blowing. And the part at the end when he's talking about Schopenhauer, I should have read that again because I couldn't really understand what he was talking about exactly, about the hallucinatory nature of the world. And I'm not sure if he's like agreeing with the idealist or what's going on there. I don't know. I guess I just need to read it again.
One question I have on that one, and you guys might not, I could probably just look this up because I'm sure there's a ton of literature on it, but on the second page of that essay, right under the number series, he mentions the third man argument against
Yeah.
Plato, which is, I guess, you know, I remember hearing about this forever. It's a sort of a classic critique of Platonic idealism, but I don't really understand how and actually I had since a lot of these, I don't know what you want to call them, paradoxes or whatever, have the same structure. I have a similar problem with some of the others, but it seems like what he's saying is if you have a form of something and then you have the thing, you can only, you have to have a third thing to carry the comparison between the other two. And then you would have to have a third thing to carry the comparison between those two. But, you know, one question is that what he's saying? And then the other one is, I don't see the problem because, and I must be just missing something here, because the way I think of Plato is the form, you don't have to compare the form and the thing through a third thing. You just say the form is the universal, you know, the universal definition, and then this is the example of it. So I don't really understand that third man argument.
Yeah, I was very much confused by that too. You know, I think, so first of all, I don't think he describes it very well in here, but it seemed to me there's like one of two ideas being communicated there. Either he was saying that in order, so basically it would be kind of like almost like a internal critique of Plato's forms, where Plato says for two things to be alike, you know, two particulars, for two cats to be alike, they have to share in this other thing that's separate from the particulars. the form of cat, the capital C. And I think Aristotle or whoever was extending that logic and saying, okay, but then in order to share in basically the form itself, there has to be some kind of a mediary between those two, which kind of makes sense. I can see at least where he's talking about it, where he's saying, okay, yeah, you need particulars, but so I think another part of this, though, I guess they're related now that I think about it, is I think he's also saying that the archetype, the form of man here is never just of that single archetype, that it always implies other things, the attributes of man that are in common. So you would need multiple forms for those that go along with the form of man. So that creates an infinite regress because every one form needs multiple forms implicated in those. And then it's like, okay, so where's the form that's higher than those that give that, a unity to its multiplicity? Because that's ultimately what Plato is saying, is there has to be a universal, a higher universal to give reality to the multiplicity of particulars. And he's basically saying that, well, your idea of the forms are basically, those are also a multiplicity. So you need some kind of a higher unity above those to mediate those according to your logic. So I think it's something like that.
That I can understand. I mean, I've worried about that, with Plato. Like I think about in terms of species and genre, for example. If you have the form of tree, that's holds all the essential features of treeness for every possible tree. But then do you have to have a form for deciduous and whatever the other one is? And how do those forms relate to the form of tree? And then do you have to have a form for each of the, types of tree under that, and so on. So, I don't know where I came up with this, but I doubt if it's original, and I doubt if it's even accurate. But, Wittgenstein said something like, the logical is the possible. And so the total universe of possibility is the total universe of what is logically consistent. So you cannot, so for example, a square circle is not possible because it's illogical, it's a logical contradiction. And so then I begin to wonder if maybe what Plato is saying is something like the forms are the totality is something like that. The forms is the totality of all logical possibility. And then how you cash that out in terms of relations between individual forms is problematic. But I begin to wonder if there's if the forms are in fact not a collection of individual entities, but are something like a field of logical possibility out of which emerge, possible entities. So for example, there could be a form for unicorn because a unicorn is a possible being. But again, there can't be a form for square circle because that is not a possible being. And there's, students have asked me, you mean there's a form for iPhone? Because, we didn't, surely we invented that. There's no form for iPhone. Well, if the forms is the totality of logical possibility, then there is a form of iPhone, because an iPhone is a possible entity that could exist. But that doesn't necessarily solve that problem, Chase, that you're talking about, but at least it seems to me like it opens the possibility for thinking of the forms as being able to embrace a kind of diverse, I don't know, it's beginning to sound like Deleuze, but a diverse continuity out of which can emerge an infinite number of particulars, something like that.
I was actually thinking that sounds really similar to Whitehead. He has basically like a interesting form of Platonism, not that I really understand it, but basically what you're just saying about kind of the totality of possibilities, that sounds like his
Mm.
idea of God, at least like the out of the two aspects of it, the aspect that's eternal, that comes up with the eternal ideas, is basically that. It's like the logic, it's the total field of all logical possibility, which that does seem to make more sense than thinking of the forms as these like discrete kind of entities on their own in Platonic heaven, and then somehow you have to figure out how do they participate in the this world, the everyday world of particulars. Because that's the real kind of stumbling block of Platonism, I think, at least for me, is okay, then how do they interact if these realms are apparently separate, yet they get their reality from this separate realm? Then how does the separate realm actually interact? You would need some kind of a mediary, it seems like. And then you're back to the same problem of basically, given all these discontinuities, how does interaction occur? Which is basically, seems to me to be kind of the essence of, this paradox of Zeno's paradox. Is basically, if we think of things as independent and separate, spatial extended objects that are separate from each other, then how do they interact while being independent? I think basically we just have to realize that things aren't really independent, that basically our mind kind of conceives of them as relatively independent, but that ultimately there's already, if you think of it as like like a song, are the notes really independent? In time, those things are constantly, note A is constantly flowing into note B, and note B is sort of contextualized by note A. They're interpenetrating, and their relations are dynamic among each other, yet they're a kind of whole in their continuity. So I think we need to think of things more like the notes of a song, rather than, like Bergson says, that we think of things in terms of these lines kind of projected out in space and abstract space. So I think that's basically what Zeno's paradox is about. Although the way that he talks about it is extending to all these other different things were kind of interesting too. Although some of them made this, the one by F.H. Bradley, where he's talking about relations, basically saying, okay, for two things to be related, you need a relation, but then for the relation and what it's relating to be related, you need another relation for that. It's kind of like, okay, I kind of get that. I think I can, maybe get around that. And then he's talking about these like logical propositions, like John is mortal requires basically a relation between John is and is mortal. Like, I don't know, at that point I would just like slap Bradley in the face if he said this to me. It was just like, I don't know, at this point it was just like getting ridiculous, which I think is what Borges kind of wants to show. But still, I just want to slap Bradley in the face. That's basically what I'm saying.
Well, can I this was to me the least not the least interesting, because he always brings up something I'm like, oh, I never heard of that. But I'm being too empirical, but I know that, I'm 10 feet away from something, and if I go half the distance, I'm 5, and then it's 2.5, and then it's whatever, and then I'll never reach it because I would only. And to me, I'm sorry, I'm going to reach the wall. You know, I'm going to open my door. I'm going to sit on the couch. I'm going to lay on my bed. I'm going to reach the things. And so to me, it was, I don't know, it was almost like showing the irreality of certain logical constructs. Does that make sense?
I thought
Yeah.
rather than showing the irreality of logical constructs, he was trying to show the irreality of reality. That there's this sort of mismatch between, I mean, that's why I think, you know, the end of the essay when he starts talking about idealism,
Mm-hmm.
that there's this sort of mismatch between how we can think about the world and how the world is. And that maybe then suggest, I mean, one possibility is the way we think about it is wrong. Another possibility is the world is not the way we think it is. And I mean, it reminds me, it's not the same thing, but it's a similar, well, in general terms, you know, there's this idea floating around that we may be in a computer simulation. And one way to support that would be if you could look at natural constants like pi, e, you know, the exponential natural logarithm base, and other natural constants. And if you could calculate them out far enough and find out that they at some point terminate, would be an indication that we may be in a simulation, because a computer, the data width in a digital computer is only so long. So, you know, like but in ours, you know, in our computers, it's like, you know, 256 bits or more, but that, you know, this computer would be, you know, assumed to have a huge data width. But if you could find there was some weirdness in the laws of physics that couldn't be accounted for by the laws of physics, that might be an indication that the reality is not what we think it is. And so I was wondering if, you know, maybe he's doing something like that these paradoxes are a possible indication that we ought to take idealism more seriously than we do.
Yeah, I think Borges is kind of trying to say both are wrong, in the sense that the way that we think of reality, there's problems with that, and then also reality itself. So Zeno's paradox, so some recent scholars have basically pointed out that Zeno was probably not actually arguing against distance, that it was most likely a reductio ad absurdum against this idea, and he was actually arguing against the Pythagorean idea about movement by showing that it led to an absurdity, and that he wasn't actually arguing in favor of this, which I'm not totally sure about that, but I see it personally as it shows how a certain way of thinking doesn't work or correspond with reality. That's the way I take it. And I think it's important, the fact that, yeah, we move around all the time. I can go and walk to, you know, somewhere in my room and accomplish that. And I mean, I think Bergson does a good job of explaining kind of why it's wrong to a certain degree. But I think Borges wants to say that I think he would somewhat agree with Bergson that basically this is a problem, you know, with our thinking. But then I think he also wants to do, you know, the idealist thing and say, because that's what it seems to be what he's saying at the end of this. He's basically saying, you know, maybe reality is wrong. Maybe that's the case. Is that, I mean, so this part about Schopenhauer, I didn't quite understand this part, because he's saying basically, so he says, to a large degree, most of these, you know, problems that he's talking about don't really hold much water, I guess. The only one would be the one formulated by Schopenhauer, have I recognized some trait of the universe. And then he goes on to say, yeah, according to this doctrine, the world is a fabrication of the will. Art always requires visible unrealities. Let it suffice for me to mention one, that metaphorical or numerous or carefully accidental diction of their interlocutors in a drama. Let us admit what all idealists admit, the hallucinatory nature of the world. Let us do what no idealist has done, seek unrealities which confirm that nature. We shall find them, I believe, in the antinomies of Kant and in the dialectic of Zeno. I don't know, I feel like I kind of get it, but I can't express it. I'm not sure. I guess that means I don't really get it. Someone help.
This isn't helping. This is me just talking or thinking out loud. So when he says, art always requires visible unrealities, a visible unreality would be, I guess, a hallucination. You know, so let us admit what all idealists admit, that the hallucinatory nature of the world. So I guess I'm just trying to figure out literally what he means, you know, just on a textual level. So he seems to be saying that it seems to be clear to Borges that some of what we actually experience is obviously, I guess, an unreality or a hallucination of some kind, and that we can, so he says, let's do what the idealist done, seek unrealities which confirm that nature. So he seems to think that there are features of our experience that we can detect are clearly unrealities. And those are, examples of those are the antinomies of Kant and the dialectic of Zeno. So that apparently these two are examples of unrealities that we can actually experience, and I guess, and know that they are in fact unrealities, even though we experience them. Now how that's the case, I don't know. And when I think of the antinomies of Kant, I don't think of something that I can experience. I think of that as something that I'm just thinking about, you know, the limits of reason.
Yeah, so he says, let us admit what all idealists admit, the hallucinatory nature of the world. Okay, I kind of get that. But then let us do what no idealist has done, seek unrealities which confirm that nature. So it's kind of like he's not even necessarily affirming any one reality, including the idealist. He more just kind of likes the skeptical or negative aspect of the idealist argument, that basically there's some aspect of the world that is an unreality. What we think of as a reality is an unreality. It's hallucinatory in some sense. And that those unrealities can be confirmed in the antinomies of Kant and the dialectic of Zeno. So he's saying, but then the hallucinatory nature of the world or whatnot that could easily be our way of thinking about it and not necessarily the world itself. It could still just be that, you know, I can't possibly think of motion because of this infinite regress, but yet I can move.
Yeah, but that's what makes me think he might be saying that, you know, it seems to me that hallucinatory and unreality are the same, either directly related or synonyms of some kind. And so that we can, in fact, detect in our own experiences that reveal that what we experience is in some sense hallucinatory or not unreal. For example, motion, because of Zeno's paradoxes. maybe that's too literal a way, but that's what it seems to me.
I have another book of Borges's writings, and this says that connected to this short story essay, that Borges's father actually taught Jorge the paradoxes of Zeno when he was a boy, when he was, I'm guessing the equivalent of grade school. So Borges was introduced as this at a fairly young age, and his father, I don't know how he would do this, I'll defer to you all, but that his father taught him the paradoxes of Zeno with the aid of a chessboard. And then when Borges was older, well, not old, but in his youth and young manhood, he would actually engage in philosophical debate about the matter. And he did. Borges wrote another. Well, actually, this is the second article that is dedicated to the subject. The earlier one is called "The Perpetual Race Between Achilles and the Tortoise," and it was included in the first edition of a collection of Borges's essays.
Is that the one? So he mentions here a few people that have formulated explanations about the paradox. He mentions Bergson, and he refers to something he's written. I've registered some of them in my book, Discussion, 1932, pages 151 to 161.
Right.
I wonder if I could find, because I have his collected nonfiction. I guess I could see if it's in there.
I think it would be.
Yeah, I'm gonna see if I can find it.
So I guess, it seemed like, and again, this is very little evidence, but it just seemed like Borges was intrigued by the paradox of Zeno, or paradoxes, and he was really trying seriously to work through the implications of them. So.
Well, I've heard some people say that the paradoxes of Zeno were solved by calculus, the infinitesimal and infinite calculus, which is the the mathematics continuity. And maybe this is too obviously an importing of Bergson into Borges, although as Chase says, he does mention him. So maybe he's pointing to the same thing Bergson is pointing to, as Chase was sort of talking around before. Maybe he's saying something like, what's hallucinatory or unreal is our experience of the world as a world of discrete objects. And what's real is the fundamental continuity of things. Maybe that's the main point. Maybe like if that source that Chase was talking about is correct, and that Zeno's really trying to show the absurdity of thinking of the world as an infinite sum of particular things, maybe what Zeno is trying to do is show that doesn't make any sense. And then maybe it's calculus that says, yeah, and here's what does make sense, is that the world is continuous. It's not discrete. It is a continuous field of phenomena. And maybe that's the reality, but maybe the hallucination or the unreality is exactly that we try to say metaphysically that it is actually a bunch of discrete little things. But if you're going to insist on that, you're going to end up with these paradoxes forever.
Mm-hmm.
That's just basically saying this essay is an essay about Bergson, which I'm not sure is fair.
Yeah.
I was maybe guilty of that too. I'm kind of reading Bergson into the end as well. Just the fact that he mentions the fabrication of the will and art, it kind of just, it brings up like creativity to me, and like how the world is going to continue and endure. And in the end too, when he says we have dreamt it as firm, mysterious, visible, ubiquitous in space, and durable in time, as if it just like continues on in space, it continues on through time. And how would that be so? and he starts it with this idea of the infinite. How would it be so that the world continues through space and time infinitely?
Yeah, I think so to, why the hell not keep going with the Bergsonian reading of this. So that's a good point about the art aspect. Also, the Novalis quote at the end talks about, the magician who plays essentially the trick on himself. That could be essentially, the logical mind, formulating this paradox and basically tricking himself, thinking, that, oh, motion doesn't make sense, But so also in the Talon story, the way that he talks about the idealist, think about the language that the idealist made. It was very process oriented, where he seemed to so the one of the languages that the people there made, had no nouns, and he had a version of the paradox for Talon, and it was totally different from Zeno's actual paradox. I think he said, I guess I'd have to go back and look at it exactly, but the way that Zeno's paradox is formulated for us, I think he is basically implying that it was impossible for them to understand that.
Well, it's, so many times in Borges, you're reading through it and you're entertained, but you're wondering, okay, what's going on here? What's the point? And Borges seems to love to, gotcha in the last paragraph or two. And it's then, so that's more of a style, an argument based on style of the author. But I'm thinking, looking at these last two paragraphs of this essay, I think, Joey quoted from it, and, I think all of you quoted from it. I think these last two paragraphs might be the summing up of Borges's take on these subjects.
Yeah, I think he has a kind of natural love of ambiguity, and I think it's really kind of like the oscillation and the indeterminacy of these paradoxes that he likes more so than that they would lead to a definite conclusion one way or another. I think he shows that he's saying basically that one way or another, this paradox shows that there's some kind of unreality to what we think of as reality, whether it's in the way that we think of it or the way we experience it. I think he's still somewhat ambivalent about that, but I think that's his general point there, and I think that would kind of fit with his other stories and whatnot.
Well, but even look at the last sentence, and he's talking about the world when he when he uses the pronoun it. We have dreamt it as firm, mysterious, visible, ubiquitous in space, and durable in time. But in its architecture, we have allowed tenuous and eternal crevices of unreason, which tell us it is false. And I mean, it seems to me what he's saying is, hey, look at these philosophical schools. They both broadly conceived. We have two different views of our world, the universe, reality, whatever. And they both have, and they're both in tension, obviously, and they're both, there's been a lot of work put into both of them. And it seems like human beings, the human race is torn between these two interpretations, and that neither one can finally be ever dominant or successful.
Yeah. So Yeah, that last sentence there, the last two sentences really. We, the undivided divinity operating within us, have dreamt the world. And yeah, the quote you just gave,
Yeah.
uh, that, so the way that he says, you know, we have dreamt it as firm, mysterious, visible, ubiquitous in space, and durable in time. That would kind of go along with the way that, you know, like a logical Greek would probably think of the world generally. Durable in time. That would be probably the only one way mysterious that would also go along with like a kind of Bergsonian perspective, but also the fact that he says, you know, the undivided divinity. Yeah, that seems pretty yeah, Schopenhauerian and somewhat Bergsonian. You know, he doesn't really explicitly talk much about the divinity, but he basically says in Creative Evolution that, you know, God is not a thing. It's just like a explosion. But but the way he says, you know, we have dreamt this, but then in its architecture, eternal crevices of unreason, which tells it's false. It's almost like he's saying, he's like giving no positive affirmation of anything except that it's not real.
Well, look at the verbs though. It's interesting to me. He says, "We have dreamt it," and then gives that list. But in its architecture, we have allowed. And I mean, it's not a perfect balance in that sentence, and other times the sentences are there's a symmetry to them, and this one it's a little bit off. You know, we've dreamt it, but then instead of saying, but we have also dreamt that it had a structure and an architecture which have allowed tenuous and eternal crevices of unreason. He didn't say that, so to me, it's just I'm a little confused over, you know, that sentence is to me just very, very interesting and very dense. And I don't know why he would say we have dreamt it this way, but in its architecture, we have allowed tenuous and eternal crevices of unreason, which tell us it is false.
So if I go sort of a Nietzschean, Bergsonian reading of those last two sentences, I'm wondering if he's saying, you know, the Schopenhauer thing is maybe, you know, my vague recollection of Schopenhauer is that the fundamental reality, this will, is continuous and undivided. It is one. And then and I think, you know, Schopenhauer says something like, this world is in a sense, the dream of that underlying reality, and that individuation is sort of an illusion that this thing dreams. And so, and then, you know, like Nietzsche says, there are no things, because there's really this Heraclitean flux is what's the fundamental stuff. And so with that kind of reading, you know, again, maybe I'm pushing too much Nietzsche and Bergson into this, but we have dreamt it as firm, you know, as a solid thing, mysterious because we don't quite get it, visible, ubiquitous in space, and durable in time. I mean, if I give a Bergsonian reading of that, it's like what we've dreamt is this rational universe that is solid and firm, and that is divided into particular objects, and that we can calculate in terms of space and time. But it's in its architecture, we've allowed it. And you know, and again, I'm reading a lot into this, but allow is almost like we've allowed the underlying, this underlying continuity to kind of seep through the cracks between these discrete entities. And unreason, not necessarily in the sense of irrational, but in the sense of can't be reasoned through, so again, the Bergsonian Nietzschean thing about one, the reason we experience the world as discrete and temporally, temporally, we're in this space-time box, is because reason has to have it that way, like Kant's thing, well, reason has to experience the world this way, and so reason makes the world appear this way. But the underlying stuff is not really like that. And then occasionally that underlying continuity kind of squirts through, and we're like, it's not exactly like we thought it was, because if you insist on these discrete objects, then there's certain, and maybe that is related to the Platonic thing. If you're going to say there's discrete forms, then you have this infinite regress that really calls for some kind of continuity rather than this discrete set of entities in the world.
Well, look too. All of us. Well, I don't want to say that. I apologize. Many people would really be unnerved if they thought that a last-minute decision of theirs, walking out the door 5 minutes later or 5 minutes earlier, would lead to their death, because some lunatic just happened to come by and say, "Oh, I see this person," and off you go. And so when you think of science, when you think of philosophy, when you think of so many endeavors of the human mind, there is this attempt to put order, right? Maybe it's little o, but order, topologies, ordering systems, theories, explanations, Kepler's laws of planetary motion. And then it seems like, wow, the world is a little less scary because it seems a little less contingent. And I think Borges is saying, yeah, we do that, and we've dreamt this, but at the same time we realize, that's why I think the word allow is interesting. We allow in its architecture the crevices that in our more, I don't want to say the word realistic, but in a different frame of mind, we accept that this other stuff, this contingent part of the world, is extraordinarily important, but it's not subject to universal laws.
Yeah, I think that the idea, so in that first part of the sentence, I think you guys have nailed that pretty much. But the second part, I see it that it's that basically the architecture we have allowed tenuous and eternal crevices of unreason. I see that as more, okay, so basically the architecture that's being built is out of, the logical mind's projection of order and, discrete chunks of reality and whatnot. That's kind of the architecture. And the thing is that out of that, and it's the very nature of it, is what allows ultimately things to show that there's something false about it, which is Zeno's paradox. So I see Zeno's paradox as basically, that's the tenuous and eternal crevice of unreason that's kind of like creaking out of the architecture of that construct of the mind that we superimpose on reality itself. And that's where Zeno's paradox is then telling us that it's false. It's telling us that the way that we've constructed the world and our mind as, this predictable, objective, spatial thing is that there's something wrong about that. And then we see that because there's cracks in it. There's cracks in the actual nature of the mind that constructs it to understand it, which is basically, that's what Zeno's paradox is.
One of Richard Feynman's lectures, the Nobel laureate physicist who's quantum mechanics, one of the, I don't know if he was an architect, one of the most respected proponents of that, of quantum mechanics, famously said, when I talked, I mean, this is a paraphrase, but when I talk to my undergraduates, when we start talking about quantum mechanics, I tell them, you won't understand it. I don't understand it. Nobody understands it. and so it's kind of an admission that, even if you can come up with these mathematical rules that give, fairly decent predictions of weird stuff that's going to happen in colliders and stuff, but trying to form a conception, a mental picture of what this stuff is trying to tell us is just very difficult. And it's almost an admission, the underlying, I mean, I don't know, I guess you can't exactly call it irrational because you can express it mathematically, but maybe irrational in the sense that we can't really understand irrational numbers. A number that can go on for, or the infinite divisibility of something. We can't really understand that because our minds aren't really well suited for grasping real infinities. And so it's maybe irrational in that sense that we just, whatever the underlying reality is, the rational mind is just not capable of grasping it in a complete sense.
Yeah, that's why when philosophies, and using that term liberally, utilize quantum mechanics or some particular interpretation of it to support their metaphysics, I'm usually highly skeptical about that move, because make it seem like, oh yeah, quantum physics says this, and then blah 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 blah, and it's like, yeah, well, there's like 5 different interpretations and the quantum physicists themselves can't agree. I've noticed that a lot with physics in general and science. They like to make very bold claims like the data says this, and then you listen to one other scientist in the same field saying the same thing, like, no, the data actually says this. Like, okay, cool. Sounds like they don't know, just like the philosophers. So, but science in a lot of ways, so what they're trying to do is give us some kind of latch of predictability on the world. And I think what quantum physics, what I guess you could say about it is, something like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, they did, essentially that is a way of figuring out a kind of pattern and determinate nature of the world, but it's just not based off individual particulars. So it's basically going against the way that Newtonian mechanistic Cartesian kind of metaphysics would work, but it's still ultimately finding some kind of a pattern or order of predictability, but it has to use massively huge numbers and statistics and probability to do it. Where the individuals themselves, that's where it doesn't make any sense in terms of the rational predictability and linear cause and effect that you see in the macroscopic world of Newtonian objects and whatnot. So I definitely think that's a sign there that, I think it kind of supports a lot of what Bergson is saying, that like our logic is based off of essentially these large inert matter spatial objects, the bowling ball, the billiard ball. That's, it's Newtonian physics. But then outside of that, we have a hard time grasping it by using the same tools. And I think quantum physics is showing something like that. And it's showing that the problem is with when we try to understand electrons as billiard balls, it suddenly doesn't make any sense. So we have to completely reformulate it into a probabilistic idea, which doesn't make any sense that, on the level of macroscopic objects that, if I drop a ball, it only goes down like probabilistically. That makes no sense to us here, but that's basically how the quantum world can at least be sort of formulated or predicted to some degree. Even that is assuming a lot because, by some interpretations, when you're not looking at something, it doesn't exist. That's another interpretation, that when no one's looking at the moon, it doesn't exist because it's still in a state of quantum superposition, and you can only collapse the quantum wave into a definite location in space by observation. So who knows?
Yeah, and the fact that there's, competing interpretations, like the many worlds versus the one you were talking about, so like there's only one reality, and that reality is the reality that is produced, through these collapsing probability functions, as opposed to the one like, no, there's an infinite number of worlds that are being generated at every point, and they're all actual worlds. And, those are two real theories that people, that very reputable physicists promote. And, again, that just, like you're saying, that sort of seems to me to indicate that we just don't really know what the hell's going on.
Yeah, exactly. That's how I interpret it. Instead of, the way that people will use just one thing and then take that as a given and then go with it and build something off of that. That's really like, no, I think really what it's showing us is that we don't know what the hell is going on there. The fact that we have like these crazy multiple interpretations, but the thing is, like, they don't really need to know what's going on in order to do their equations and their math, shut up and calculate as their maxim. So because they're based off, pragmatics, like industry. They, make electronics. That's all they care about. Basically, that they can predict something, that they can manufacture things, shut up and calculate, and then it's basically us philosophers that are just like, well, what the hell does this mean or whatnot? But then, I mean, a lot of the great theoretical physicists and whatnot are also philosophers. If you look at, people like Schopenhauer and whatnot, they were very philosophically minded. I think you kind of have to think in a theoretical way like that.
Should we move to another essay?
Sure. I think so.
What is your pleasure? I personally like stouts, but sorry, I was a beer joke. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I did not get it.
You need to get out more, but then that's kind of impossible.
Yeah, it's like,
No, that is very true. I don't think I've left my house in like a week and a half or something.
Oh, dude, you've got to get out of your house.
Well, I mean, I've like gone outside. I just haven't like driven somewhere or whatnot. But mainly, I haven't driven my car in that long.
How far have you walked?
I walked down. So I live pretty close to the river in Wimberley, and I've walked down to there and just kind of walked back. But so there's actually this app called Random Nautica that I told Joey about, and it's basically it gives you a kind of random position based off of, so actually it uses these quantum random number generators and basically gives you some kind of a random location that you can go to and just explore. Maybe I should do that. Some people found like a dead body using it, So I'm kind of hoping I can find something exciting like that too.
I would rather find a pot of gold or
Just
or
follow the rainbow.
the secret method of Bergson for entering into pure intuition or something like that. So Chase, were you going to suggest, or was someone going to suggest a essay? I don't mean to put it all on you. I just thought you made some noises that I cut off.
Yeah, I was thinking about recommending The Mirror of Enigmas, because this one is pretty out there. Okay, sure. Why the hell not? This reminds me a lot of Philip K. Dick, a lot. I think he actually references this person, this Leon Bleu, French guy.
Is that a real person?
You know what? I didn't actually check.
Because I'm just remembering, the different
familiar.
fake people that Borges brings in as authority.
That is very true. Before I guess
Go ahead.
if that's the case, I've already embarrassed myself. But
We'll look it up.
I mean, he quotes him.
Okay, thank God, he's a real person.
He was a real guy.
Okay.
Yeah.
He was a French novelist, essayist, pamphleteer, and poet, known additionally for his eventual passionate defense of Roman Catholicism.
Huh.
Yeah, well, that makes sense with the whole St. Paul thing.
Well, if you look at it, it kind of reminds me of this essay. Reminds me a little bit in structure of Kafka and his precursors, because Borges is looking at different literary texts, right? The first is from June 1894. The second is from November of the same year. The fourth and this. And so but Borges sees a link in them, or creates a link with them or for them.
Yeah, I definitely saw it too. I guess we can even try to combine talking about both, because I definitely see a connection in the idea that, so to use Deleuzian terminology, it basically be that what he's talking about is there's a kind of multiplicity of potential for all of these things that, so in the same way that the writers that were precursors to Kafka had a kind of potential of emphasis or whatnot, of resemblance to Kafka that was always there, but it became actualized when Kafka actually wrote and became famous, and people went and looked back with Kafka in mind. That there's a kind of sort of inherent plurality of potentials beyond just the very superficial world of bare actuality.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I see a lot in this Mirror of Enigmas, when he's talking about basically an incalculable symbolic value to everything, that there's almost like a double to everything that is this sort of like symbolic structure where things participate in other things.
Well, that, I don't know, Chase, you and I think Hunter and maybe Joey know more about this kind of stuff, but there's been arguments that we live in a fundamentally symbolic world, and that everything, I'm thinking of, what's the guy's name that the Matrix relied on? Starts with a B.
Baudrillard.
Yeah, Baudrillard. And that we live in a world of symbols, and everything is a symbol. And if that's true, that really opens up. I mean, like Nietzsche says, everything's an interpretation, but then it's like interpretation all the way down. And that you get into this, and maybe that's part of what this is. If that's the case, then there is, in some sense, there is no world, there may be a world that is independent of interpretation, but it's not one we could ever get to or find. So that everything is fundamentally interpretation piled on interpretation piled on interpretation.
Wow. That's so, yeah, I definitely didn't see the Baudrillard connection with that. I think Borges
Maybe
would
I'm
have liked
completely
that.
wrong there.
So what it reminded me of was medieval realism, in the way that I learned in that what was that class? Philosophy, the meaning of life. That was it. That I took. How long ago was that? Whatever. With Dr. Mehta, and we read this book that was talking about. Okay, it was basically looking at these sort of manuals of plants and basically botanical knowledge that they wrote in basically these medieval manuscripts, and they're wondering, why are all the illustrations basically not really trying to depict the plant in a realistic fashion of just, simply what it looks like. And they made the case that basically that's because they saw the reality more so with the symbolic value of the plant. So basically, that it has white flowers which connect with the Virgin Mary, which connects with, ideas of innocence and purity and whatnot. And they would basically exaggerate the symbolic elements of these plants because that's what they saw as the actual reality to it, where just just seeing it as only what it looks like without any kind of symbolic resonance, that to them was a kind of obscuring of reality ultimately. So it reminded me a lot of that, in the sense that basically what the medieval realists were saying, at least in that sense, was that something gains its reality by, almost a kind of platonic participation with these other orders of reality. And it's basically this, this divine reality of ultimate meaning that gives everything else meaning through a kind of reverberation through all these different layers. And then you can kind of see that ultimately in even the everyday particulars, that you could see, that you doing something kind for someone is like a version of Jesus dying on the cross or something. That's pretty dramatic, but something to that degree, that there's some kind of deeper symbolic value to these things.
The way I heard that expressed years ago, I was involved with this Christian contemplative group, and so the guy that led it had read a lot of medieval literature, mystical and otherwise, and he said that, and it's probably part of the same tradition, but in Genesis, God literally speaks the world into existence. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And so one interpretation of that sort of thinking is that the world is literally the spoken word of God. And so they would say there are two books that God has written. One is scripture and one is the world, nature. And so you have the manifestation of the word of God in the Bible, but then you also have the literal word of God in creation. And so if the flower is a word of God, then the flower is going to have this sort of symbolic representational value. I mean, I think at the first sentence, when he says the idea that the sacred scriptures have a symbolic value is ancient, not irrational. And then he goes on to say that the whole world could be like that. He just mentions Leon Bloy, but that idea is a very ancient idea as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely see how that's kind of what's, so that also reminds me a lot of Philip K. Dick. And so he was also influenced a lot by, you know, Kabbalah and this way of kind of interpreting these things. And they say something similar, that basically they give, so they have, you know, a holy text, this, you know, what Borges talks about, like the absolute text, the ultimate text with zero contingency that basically contains everything. And if you see it something like that, then you can see also that creation in some way was basically like a book and structured in the same way like a book, so that you could take the way that the Bible or the Torah or whatnot is structured as a text and the meaning in it, and you would see that behind everything in phenomenal reality. And Philip K. Dick has a bunch of ideas where he talks about basically the world as like as a sort of face-based projection of the Bible and things like that. And he goes into a lot of so one of his like many experiences is he wrote this book, and in the book there's a bunch of events that happen in it. I'm not going to go into the details, but he was explaining it to, so he one night he basically had the things in his book come true for him. That, so it was he was driving and he saw somebody that looked like they needed help. They ran out of gas. He went back and picked up this person and drove them to a gas station and helped them out or something like that. And then he realized while he was driving this guy there, that this had occurred in one of his books. And he was like, okay, that's weird. And he told his preacher about it. And he said, basically what you're describing to me is the book of Acts. Like, that's the book of Acts. And he was just like, I didn't read that. I don't know what you're talking about. He's like, go read it. And he goes and reads it. And it's very similar to basically what he wrote in his book and also what happened to him. And even the guy's name was Philip too, and a bunch of weird stuff. So basically then Philip K. Dick, of course, uses his superpowers of science fiction and comes up with this idea as basically like we're living inside the world of Acts, and basically everything is kind of like in a sort of projection of those events that are working like Platonic forms or Jungian archetypes or something like that. So similar idea here, and especially something based off the text, I think is also important to understand. And he actually uses St. Paul's idea, you know, through a mirror darkly.
Through a glass darkly.
Yeah. So he uses that a lot. Philip K. Dick in the exegesis, there's probably like a few hundred pages where he's talking about that quote, to the point where he's like, some of his ideas are like that that time is really moving backwards. He's really the idea that there's basically like an inversion or some kind of reversal state that St. Paul was trying to hint at.
Did Philip A. Dick ever read Wells?
Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure he did, because he was a science fiction writer. So he was and especially as a kid, he was pretty much a voracious reader of all the science fiction.
The reason why I ask is in the time machine, in the way Wells relates the year that it is in the future, just gives you a sense of winding down, that it's devolution. And so it's almost like a clock just ticking slower and more slowly. And it's almost a reversion to well, not hunting and gathering, but highly atomistic people who happen to live near each other, and a lot of indifference.
I put a link in the chat, which is the link to an IMDb page for the movie Pi. I don't know if any of you have watched that, but it's about this mathematician who discovers the ultimate number that gives the key to reality. And it eventually starts driving him insane, but he has at least two groups of people who are desperately trying to grab him and pull this out of his mind. And one of them is, not surprisingly, a group of Jewish mystics, Kabbalists. and the other one is a group of, I don't know, some government group, CIA or something, that's trying to exploit this. But anyway, it's a deeply gritty, unpleasant film to watch, but pretty fascinating. You know what this made me think of, is this mirrors one thing that made me think is I was reading the essay on humanism by Sartre for this ethics course that I'm finishing up right now, and one of the sort of this is not just Sartre, but the sort of sense you get is that people invoke God because they want there to be sense and meaning to the world, and to be an ultimate reason for everything, and that it's just too unpleasant to contemplate the opposite. So they come up with this, with this notion of God. And these varying ideas from Bloy make me think, or it almost like feels like a person who is absolutely desperate to read order out of the world in some way, even if it's a difficult order, that it's like this desperation to find some sort of sense and order in the world. But on the other hand, it's kind of, some of it's deeply unsettling. So I was thinking, like I could think of what Chase was describing in Philip K. Dick that way as well, that he wants to find this structure and order in the world, and it has this predetermined, preordained narrative quality to it, and therefore it makes sense. But on the other hand, the visions that that Philip K. Dick comes up with are not particularly comforting. And so, I'm not sure how that fits. It's like there's this traditional notion that you come up with these sorts of cosmic explanations to make the world a more comforting place, but then you've got people like Philip K. Dick who come with these cosmic explanations that are deeply, unsettling.
Yeah, he kind of doesn't fit into that picture in a very neat way at all. Although you can kind of see, he definitely believed that something extraordinary had happened to him. And he was trying to come up with explanations basically that made sense to him about what this was. He was very interested in basically like what actually happened to me. What is going on with reality that could make this possible? And that was kind of what drove him to just speculate about all these things. And but then it became a kind of, it's actually pretty complex, because I think there was something like a kind of sense of fabulation, I guess you could call it, where so Eric Davis, who's a really good scholar on Philip K. Dick, he talks about how he kind of programmed himself to kind of give some validity to his ideas by essentially forgetting about them and then only to rediscover them. And that it's not that he was being intentionally dishonest to himself, of course, that's, not necessarily possible in a sense, but that there was kind of like, complex psychological factors going on that made him basically, he wanted something to be true in some sense, and he was kind of allowing those things to happen that would kind of back up that idea in some sense. Although other times he tries to dismiss everything, and that was at times he would want to burn all of his papers and stuff, and he would say that it's completely worthless, and that, but then basically a few days later he would just be back at it trying to figure out the universe all over again with some new grand theory. And that was kind of the thing. He was constantly starting over. But yeah, I think there's definitely interesting aspects to, we need some kind of way to think about, to interpret what happens in reality. And even if we don't, aren't explicitly, formulating grand ontologies and metaphysical systems, everyone has some kind of implicit idea about what reality is. And I think that's kind of what this is getting at to some degree. And the thing is for Borges and all these things, I think what he really likes about it is just that there's nothing necessarily simple or pre-given about it, that there's this kind of ambiguous nature to it. And I don't know, I see that as somewhat liberating to a certain degree, although I can see why it would lead to, like these Kierkegaardian categories of despair and whatnot. But yeah, I don't know, fun stuff.
I would like to talk about the note on or toward Bernard Shaw. I don't know a lot about Shaw either, but I think the idea, the basic idea that, this recalls the Library of Babylon, but it's interesting. It's almost like a critique of it, in that, you could have every possible combination of letters and have every book that could be written with that, but that would still not exhaust all the possibilities of meaning, because that meaning always occurs through some sort of dialogue between the reader and the book. So I thought that was a pretty fascinating thesis. And then in the last paragraph, though, I thought it was an interesting critique of, he actually talks about this earlier as well, but he comes back to this critique of metaphysics as, I guess, a kind of game. And I was wondering what you guys thought about that. So, he talks about Heidegger and Jaspers make of us the interesting interlocutor in a secret and continuous dialogue with nothingness or the divinity, respectively, I think. These disciplines, which in the formal sense can be admirable, foment that illusion of the ego which the Vedanta censures as a capital error. They usually make a game of desperation and anguish, but at bottom, they were actually flattering our vanity. They are, in this sense, immoral. And then he contrasts that to the work of Shaw, however, leaves one with a flavor of liberation. I haven't read enough of Shaw to really know what he means by that, but it's an interesting criticism of metaphysics, and I don't know what you would call Jasper's metaphysical theology or something, to say that they're really playing games, and they are just furthering this distortion. They're really just flattering our vanity. And anyway, I was curious as to what you guys thought about that kind of criticism.
So one thing that I think is interesting about this one is, so to go along with our hallucinatory projection of meaning by putting it into the category of Bergsonian Nietzscheanism. So at the the first page of this, he critiques metaphysics as basically that it sees all these things as combinations, a kind of play with combinations. He talks about Raymond Lully's machine, and then the chaotic library, which is obviously what the Library of Babel is based on. And I think that would go along with the idea that, he's saying basically the fiction aspect of it or whatnot is this idea that it's these discontinuous, isolated elements, and life is just simply a combinations of these different elements. He's basically challenging that idea, and instead he's saying that, there's actually much more going on here. The dialogue is infinite. And then, so that's kind of like the first part of his argument. And then the second part is basically talking about this sort of plurality that the artist, the writer, whatnot can use. So that basically, okay, so he talks a lot about this idea of, it's a book is not an isolated being. It is a relationship, an axis of innumerable relationships. And part of that is the role of the reader in it, which I think is really important for him, but it's the role of the reader that interprets this based off of some kind of dramatic persona of the author. And I think the creation of that dramatic persona is sort of what he's kind of detailing here. But yeah, once again, like me, I haven't read enough Bernard Shaw than, Modest Proposal or whatnot, to really understand what he's talking about here. Although it seems like, is he kind of saying that basically Shaw is, that he has kind of like this fluidity in this dramatic persona that he created, that something like different or special is occurring here. Like he says, the biography of Bernard Shaw by Frank Harris contains an admirable letter by the former, from which I copy the following words: I understand everything and everyone, and I am nothing and no one. From this nothingness, so comparable to that of God before creating the world, so comparable to that primordial divinity, which another Irishman, blah, 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 called nihil, Bernard Shaw adduced almost innumerable persons or dramatis personae. So there's something about that he sees as very noble. But I'm not exactly totally sure what he's getting at with that, because then the other ones that he talks about, he seems to kind of critique these other ones as being too almost anthropocentric. Yeah, so like the man's character and its variations are the essential theme of the novel of our time. The philosophies of Heidegger and Jaspers make each of us the interesting interlocutor in a secret and continuous dialogue with nothingness or the divinity. These disciplines, which in the formal sense can be admirable, foment that illusion of the ego, which the Vedanta censures as a capital error. So I guess he's saying basically the better thing would be, when constructing your dramatic persona, to be more aware that you're doing just that it's something you're kind of constructing, this ego. I guess that we're all doing that. And it's basically just like ultimately this challenge against, this element of the ego, just like the combinations of elements that he kind of critiques at the first part of this.
So I'm wondering, I would want to contrast that illusion of ego in that last paragraph with what you read in the couple of paragraphs back. when he says, Shaw's biographer says, I understand everything and everyone, and I am nothing and no one. So that seems to be the opposite of sort of an ego-centered way of writing. And then, that reminded me all the way back on page 198 on that essay about Valerie, the last paragraph. Let's see. Paul Valery leaves us at his death a symbol of a man infinitely sensitive to every phenomena, for whom every phenomena is a stimulus capable of provoking an infinite series of thoughts, of a man who transcends the differential traits of the self, and of whom we can say, as William Hazlitt did of Shakespeare, he is nothing in himself. I can't find this, but there's a short story or essay by Borges in one of the books I've got where he's describing Shakespeare from the first person point of view. And you don't know he's describing Shakespeare until the end, but it's sort of the negative aspect of this, where he's sort of this empty vessel through which these characters come and play out. And he has no strong sense of himself, but that's what allows these characters to become fully formed within himself. And so then I in this essay on Shaw, he seems to be contrasting this emptiness, this sort of non-egoistic artistic mind, with these philosophers who in his views seem to be just, I don't know what he thinks they're doing, just promoting themselves through their philosophies. It reminds me of Nietzsche saying that philosophies are just the confessions of their authors, so that every philosopher is really just expressing his own. I think it's it's a section called on the prejudices of philosophers. So philosophers are presenting their own personal convictions as though they were universal metaphysical truths. And maybe he's saying Shaw and Shakespeare somehow avoid doing that by, I want to say, like the sort of kenosis, almost the sort of emptying of themselves. Because he says, as you read, from this nothingness, so comparable to that of God before creating the world and to the primordial divinity, Bernard Shaw educes almost innumerable persons. So again, that sort of kenosis of, emptying God's self into the world, that Bernard Shaw does something like that, as opposed to this sort of imposing oneself onto the world.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. That would definitely go along with how he kind of presents artistic creation in his other stories, like the Circular Ruins, where he definitely sees this idea of kind of an artistic creation as this, self-emptying kenosis, that you're more of a conduit or a medium of artistic creation than necessarily like this all-powerful author that consciously creates these things. I think that makes sense, and that's why he thinks Shaw is interesting, because there's a sort of fluidity or almost emptiness of his own sort of particular ego there, and that's what allows, I guess, a bigger sort of plurality of other characters to come through. I still feel like there's something like I just don't understand about this, but oh well. Maybe we're not supposed to understand anything. Maybe that's the whole point of this book.
Well, I mean, in fairness to all of us, I think, I mean, I don't think I've ever read a Shaw play. I mean, I know I saw the movie version of Pygmalion that came out in the 1930s, and I think Shaw was still alive and hand in the structure of it. But I think I would understand this more if I had actually read, even if it was just a few things like Arms and the Man, because that seems to be a play that is brought up and restaged many times, much more than some of his others. I mean, obviously Pygmalion because of My Fair Lady, but and so and remember, it's I don't know what page it is for all of you, but for my copy, it's at the bottom of the second page after he talks again of he can't seem to leave Don Quixote alone, and he compares why can't I pronounce his name? The Three Musketeers man, D'Artagnan. Executes innumerable feats, and Don Quixote is beaten and ridiculed, but one feels the valor of Don Quixote more. The foregoing leads us to an aesthetic problem never before posed. Well, pat yourself on the back, Borges. Can an author create characters superior to himself? And Borges answers no. And in that negation include both the intellectual and the moral. I believe that from us cannot emerge creatures more lucid or more noble than our best moments. And then this leads him to his take on Shaw. It is on this opinion that I base my conviction of Shaw's preeminence. So what he's saying is Shaw's characters show a lot of intellect. They show a lot of moral, I'm guessing moral courage, or at least moral behavior, and fairly consistently and across maybe different types of characters, male, female, different situations, environments. And it is interesting to me that Borges, as the writer, would ask that question, of writers in general, people who write fiction. And I know this has nothing to do with this piece, but what jumped out at me when I was reading this, and then all of these last five, because of the sheer number of authors. Sorry, my cat jumped on the table and everything was going to go to hell. If you think of the number of real authors, either philosophers, fiction writers, poets, whatever, who Borges has cited in all of the literature, to me, what jumps out is a huge silence. He never once mentions Dostoevsky. And it would just be really interesting to me if I knew, did he ever read a Dostoevsky novel? And if he did, I'm not saying Borges and Dostoevsky are brothers who never met each other. I think they're very, very different. But it's just interesting to me who Borges gravitates to. And to me, Shaw is, I don't consider Shaw philosophical in the ignorance that I have of Shaw, but Borges, who has a bent to really be interested in philosophical questions, is actually very complimentary of him in this piece, and it makes me want to read Shaw, frankly, because of how complimentary Borges is of Shaw.
So I just looked in the index of his collected or selected nonfictions, and it looks like he has some stuff in here about Dostoevsky. The one thing I flipped to, I don't see where this reference is. So here's something about it. Okay, so he did at least mention him, I guess. But yeah, I would find that you could definitely see the connection there in their themes, which is why I would think that he would have read him. So I think he did. Yeah, who knows? But yeah, I'm still kind of confused about basically. I think it's just because I'm almost completely ignorant about Shaw, except know almost anything about his plays, and that's why it's kind of like hard for me to really understand his kind of praise. So I basically can only understand in kind of abstract terms, where I really need some kind of like a concrete something to hold on to in order to get what he's getting at.
Well, I think it's the depth of character and the characteristics of his characters. Because if Borges is right, that an author cannot create characters that are, I mean, I thought he used the word greater, superior to himself. At least that's the translation I have. I don't know what the word is in your all's translations. And he says, can an author create characters superior to himself? I would say no. And in that negation include both the intellectual and the moral. It's interesting that he looks at it in both categories.
Yeah. So I don't really associate him with being a very morally inclined author, Borges, that is.
Well, Shaw was very much, my memory is that he was roughly 40 years old in 1900, because he lived almost to be 100 years old. He was in his 90s. And my memory is he was very involved with the Webbs, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who were the founders of the Fabian Society, which basically was a bunch of intellectuals that created the candle power for the modern British Labour Party, basically British socialism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, there was one extended disagreement between Shaw and H.G. Wells, and it was weird. H.G. Wells seemed to have a sad ability to push a position that a majority of the people agreed with in an organization, but he did it in such an abrasive way that it caused people to side with the other side. And H.G. Wells just blasted the Fabian Society with modern weaponry. And Shaw, who it comes across many times as this intellectual rights plays puffing on a pipe, but he waded into the controversy and basically reformulated the issue and said, sure, yeah, let's talk about how we can improve the Fabian Society, and what are your very specific suggestions. And he was so accommodating, and Wells seemed to be so abrasive that basically Wells was completely ineffectual in his attempt to change things.
There's a quote on page 211, and this one, it's the second, third to the last paragraph. It's only one little thing, so it's a quotation from Albert Sorgel. Could write, repeating a commonplace of the time, Bernard Shaw is an annihilator of the heroic concept, a killer of heroes. I don't know what that means, and I don't know any of the people who he quotes after this, but he says he did not understand that the heroic might dispense with the romantic and be incarnated, and I don't know who those people are, but at least it looks like it was at the time it's a little ambiguous as to how he was viewed, as like the killer of the hero. I don't know enough about Shaw to know what that means, but so.
That kind of makes sense to me, in the sense that he was sort of inverting the idea of heroes in literature to try to give so this guy's saying he's an annihilator, but then Borges says basically he's being misunderstood, that the heroic might dispense with the romantic and be incarnated in, and I take these people there's some kind of like common people, and he's trying to almost like democratize heroicism in a sense. Or maybe he's even has some kind of a concept like an anti-hero kind of literature, but that's at least how I saw that.
Okay. Well, we done for another day?
Yeah, probably.
I think we just have one more or two more meetings. It's not very many.
2 more, I
Two more,
believe.
I think. Yeah.
So at least the next one looks like it'll mainly be just this one, a new refutation of time. So that should be interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm always interested in refutations of time. I was a teaching assistant in a introduction to philosophy class at UT. So, freshmen who've never read any philosophy, and the instructor had them read McTaggart's Refutation of Time.
Mhm.
And I had never even read it. And it was a terrifying experience trying to explain a refutation of time that I myself did not understand to freshmen.
Oh God. Yeah.
Before we leave, I need to apologize. I'm sorry for leaving because I was interested in what you and Chase were saying, Nevid, about Shaw, but it started to rain here and all the windows of my car was open, and I live in a real old house that when it was built, no one had an automobile in San Marcos. So I thought, no, I can't have the car, because with my luck, it would be a downpour for 5 minutes and everything would be damaged. So
No worries.
Yeah, we were just basically sharing our ignorance.
Yeah, pretty much. So.
Well, but look at, and I know Pygmalion is maybe understudied because it got turned into My Fair Lady and a Warner Brothers musical. But I thought Shaw had an extraordinarily interesting point of saying, you change a person's speech, you change how they speak, and you are literally opening the world to them. At least in English speaking world, that they will then be accepted and be able to, just accomplish an amazing thing. And we really don't talk about language in that way as barrier as much as bridge.
My mother grew up. She would say she was white trash. She grew up she was the daughter, one of 4 children in a sharecropper family in Alabama, and they were, just dirt poor farmers. And when and her big dream was to get the hell out of there and not have to marry the sharecropper down the road. And so she did, and she eventually went to college, and she was a Southern Baptist, and so she was concerned about evangelism and that sort of thing. And one of her teachers at some point in college told her, you've got to lose that accent, because if you don't, no one will hear anything you say except the accent. No matter how articulate you are, no matter how well read and how intelligent you are, all they will hear is that accent. And so she could kind of turn it on and off like a switch, but she, over the period of, I don't know how long it took her, but she lost the accent. And I found myself actually, I've listened to people speak that had some kind of hick accent, and I'm like, oh my God, this person is an idiot. And then I start listening, it's like, oh, wait a minute, they're not an idiot. They're actually saying intelligent things. So it seems
remember Jonathan Winters?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was from central southern Ohio. So many people don't realize that the South crosses the Ohio River. Mm-hmm. And so southern Ohio, southern Indiana, southern Illinois are really south. And so he was perfect because he could speak in a more non-specific Midwest accent, but at the same time turn on you remember some of his, he just turned on the southernness, small town hick, and you're like, oh, and he knew what he was doing, right? Because then all of a sudden it was like, okay, there's Bubba right in front of you, and so he had a very good ear and vocal control, but it was to help inhabit or well, to literally give voice to these different characters that were running around in his head.
Yeah, I've noticed for myself that I can basically speak in a perfect Texas accent, and well, especially if I drink, it'll kind of come out sporadically in a kind of half ironic way, sort of. It's like something that's like virtually present within me as this potential dramatic persona, and it only comes out basically upon consumption of alcohol, it seems like, or unless I want to just like mock someone or something. But yeah, it's there, hidden deep inside.
Now, bless your pea picking heart, Chase.
Yeah.
Yeah, my mother never taught me the accent, so I never picked up her. So I'm sure she intentionally did not teach me that accent.
That actually sounds all like my mom's story, except so she grew up in Iowa, and the thing was basically get out of Iowa.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing here but corn. Although
Now
she had the benefit of being from the Midwest, where, they don't have a hick accent. They talk like, news anchors, like perfectly ordinary. It's basically the accent equivalent of corn. It's just perfectly ordinary.
There's actually I don't know, I think it's considered a dialect. I was in some class in college called American Standard. And that may be what that is, what you're describing there, but it is it really is a dialect, but to us, it sounds like it's the absence of accent, but it's really, it's a particular dialect called American Standard.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there's no such thing as a absence of accent. Americans that believe, the only country or the default country is America in the universe, that's a thing. Like our American, that's not an accent, that's just the way to talk, and everything else is, abnormal.
Like those damn Brits.
Yeah,
exactly.
If you look at an older generation, it's interesting, of the news anchors, I want to say that Edward R. Murrow was either from Washington State or Oregon. Chet Huntley was from Montana. Walter Cronkite was from Missouri. And the outlier in a way is Brinkley. David Brinkley was actually from North Carolina. And when he got older, you sometimes could hear it at the end of his sentences. But when it's going back to your point, Nevitt, about an American Standard. And frankly, I honestly think that television on top of radio really contributed so much to the evening out or sanding down some of the edges of accents in the United States.
That makes a lot of sense.
And I'm sure it happened in Germany. I mean, I remember reading things that a Northern German could not literally understand a Southern German. 120 years ago, in some areas, especially if they were a small town.
Well, when I listen to like an English TV, a British TV show, and if someone has a really strong Cockney accent or something, I can't, I have to turn the subtitles on. I can't hear it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Or sometimes a really strong Scottish brogue.
Yeah.
I just don't hear it.
Oh, the Scottish accent is the worst. That it's so difficult to understand. Yeah. Now, I think, a lot of people, I mean, I guess they aren't aware that there's a lot of different type of British accents and even English accents that,
Yeah.
you know, a Northern Manchester accent is going to be pretty different from the, was it like the received pronunciation and, you know, the Queen's English and all that stuff. And some of it is very hard to understand. And even a lot of the other accents in London, when I went there, honestly, I had a hard time understanding a lot of people. And these are just English people live in London. I was just like, what? I was just constantly saying what. And then the Scottish people, I was just like, oh my God, like this is unbearable. Like I could never live in Scotland because I would just constantly be like, what? Or just like pretending to understand them. It would just be awful. Like I'd be better off at least like if I lived in a country like, I don't know, like Spain or France, I could just be like, I don't know. I don't know your language very well. But in Scotland and England, you can't say that. You just be like, you talk funny. I can't understand you.
Yeah, they think you're deaf.
Yeah, exactly.
I have to take off. I enjoyed today
Okay.
as always. Be safe.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
See you.
See you guys.
Bye,
All right,
guys.
bye.
Talk to you next week or Friday, hopefully.
Yeah, Friday.